Halo 1 was just another game to me. You know, I played it as a kid, I enjoyed it, but it was just another shooter, of which I hadn't played many of back then, but it wasn't mind-blowing. Thing is, I just didn't know it at the time, how effortlessly it managed to do everything so well. So fast forward 19 years, I'm older and supposed to be more wiser, clearly I'm not, and it finally re-releases on PC where I can appreciate it, and where I can finally play with mouse and keyboard. And it's still great. It's not a generic shooter at all. Ooh, whatto chaps, I'm MagicalMike, and recently I played through Halo 1 numerous times with my mate Kez as we took on the legendary campaign, the par times, the par scores, the Easter eggs, the weird achievements, the speedrun, the multiplayer, and of course, LASO. I was excited for Halo 1, more so than Reach, but I was aware of the nostalgia and hoping it would hold up not just because of that. Turns out that we're okay on that front, so if all you need to hear is go buy the Master Chief Collection on PC because it's worth it, then there you go. But of course there's stuff to talk about in some detail. For those of you that don't already know Halo, in its simplest form, it's a shooter with regenerating shield mechanic, where shields and health are affected differently by different weapons. Plasma or energy weapons hurt shields more than health, and ballistics work the opposite way around. And you'll run into some enemies that have personal shields, jackals that carry a more traditional style one, and grunts that do not. So using the right weapon type for the enemies that you're facing is important, and makes the gameplay stand out among other shooters. It's also a much slower game than Reach was, mostly because it was the first of the lot, so there's no sprint or dodging or abilities, just a brisk walking speed and your ability to shoot. Oh, and also pretty high jumps, I guess, with occasional vehicle segments that I always remembered as being a standout feature at the time. Levels are pretty big, man. If you don't believe me, then go and do the level Halo without using a Warthog and tell me that 15 minutes of running isn't big enough for you. Weapon variety is smaller than I remember it being, with the assault rifle being the biggest difference in my memory. I remember it tearing enemies apart as I ran through and sprayed with it, but it doesn't quite work that way in Legendary difficulty. Oh no, maybe you'll upset some grunts, but the elites won't give a damn. You better hope that you can backsmack them, else you'll best have a plasma pistol in your pocket to remove that big old personal shield that they've got. Rockets are still fun, as in any game, unless you meet enemies with them. You know that one corridor on 2 betrayals? Yeah. Snipers are great, still packing a punch, but the pistol is going to be your go-to weapon because it can absolutely destroy everything. I mean, hunters, the strongest, most terrifying enemy that the Covenant will throw at you, get literally one-shot by it in Halo 1, which is amazing stuff. Then you got weapons like the Needler or the Noodler, which, well, it hits like a bunch of noodles, and the Plasma Rifle, which just doesn't quite compete with the pistol, but at least it doesn't have a weird sound bug on it. And finally there's the shotgun, which comes at the most perfect time in the campaign, when suddenly the Flood get introduced in a level that I totally forgot about, but is one of those iconic moments in gaming to this day. Though, speaking of the Flood, I really hate how the sniper does literally 0 damage to them, and the only other semi-effective thing is the pistol. You go shotgun, or you go home. Dead. I think the AI is what makes Halo great to replay over and over. The way that grunts react based on you killing them too quickly, or sticking them, or surprising them, or killing their leader elites, making them panic, and the way that those same elites will aggressively try to advance on you, and even flank when they can, or hide when their shields go down, makes every encounter go quite differently every single time you approach them. And as it happens, you'll be approaching similar looking encounters a lot, because they do end up reusing a lot of scenery and levels, sometimes in reverse, sometimes just the same level. And I'd forgotten that a lot of Halo 1 ended up being reused, like Assault on the Control Room, 2 Betrayals, Keys, and Truth and Reconciliation, but it never quite seems to outstay its welcome because the gameplay is fun. Something else to consider is that the tick rate on PC does make the AI much harder than its 30 FPS console counterpart too, which makes things slightly different than you might remember, difficulty-wise, with AI being able to react much more quickly to you than you might remember. The anniversary release added a whole new set of audio and graphics too. You can toggle it on PC with just the press of the tab key, and I personally really enjoy the new graphics, but they do cause a few issues. They do change the atmosphere of some levels, importantly on 343 Guilty Spark and Truth and Reconciliation, even the library a little bit, but they also change the hitboxes of a lot of scenery and enemies, making elites much harder to headshot for example, and certain details harder to spot for speedrunning, and certain cliffs a hazard when shooting rockets or trying to take cover behind now invisible walls. Boom, right in your face. You didn't expect it. The sound's really good though. I enjoy the added reverb and a lot of punch to the weapons that they've now added in those indoor sections. Just sounds really good. And of course the music, you've got to mention the music, even if a lot of it does feel very backgroundy. But that of course is by design. Now then, let's talk speedrun. The Goatroped achievement for beating Legendary in under 3 hours is tough. Real tough, but with people like Naked Eli and Halo Completionist on YouTube, it's very learnable, and the tricks are once again satisfying to pull off. Most of it involves small optimizations on movement, grenade jumps, and knowing where level triggers are and how to exploit those things, along with where weapons and ammo are and how to efficiently kill enemies in combat. You'll also find that jumping in Halo 1 is a little bit finicky too, because if Chief's feet aren't touching the ground, then you can't jump. I mean, well, obviously, right? But it turns out that slightly uneven floors can cause your jump inputs to drop, which feels unnatural and can cause you to mess up very important skips. The run is so hard because it's mostly just get good, in that you've got to pull off those tight tricks while also being good at doing the combat and being aware of those uneven surfaces and dropped jump inputs. You can't avoid everything. In fact, you have to do a ton of combat in Halo Combat Evolved. Who'd have thunk it, right? And with enemies reacting differently from run to run, there's not always a perfect set of inputs to just learn and then reproduce success. You've got to adapt. So the first level is mostly that, optimizing grenade placement, when to charge plasmas, and where remaining enemies will be and how they react to you. Good practice and not too difficult with such a huge ammo abundance. Halo is mostly the same, but it's tough to do the whole dropship section at speed because you're not taking cover as much. I spent a lot of that speedrun in particular at very little health, which is not good. Luckily the frags are like little nukes in this game, so it's fun to time and place them right in that section. Also failing that, just sticking all the elites with plasmas is a good time too. Backpack reloading is a huge time save also. It's a very easy trick, just double tap the reload before swapping weapons and it'll, well, reload itself while it's in your backpack. It's a neat trick and very underappreciated. Truth and Reconciliation was one of my toughest levels to get right. Again, it's mostly just getting the combat right, but there's a critical grenade jump that you can make in a hangar that despawns a ton of enemies, and skips probably like 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the level too, thankfully. Keys though is still a complete moron, willing to throw grenades and then run right towards them, which resets your progress if he decides to play fetch. Bad dog. Silent Cartographer is mostly just kind of hilarious really, because it's non-linear, meaning that you can skip absolutely tons of it and trick a Warthog into throwing you beyond a door that early on that's supposed to lock you out. It also has a badass beach landing sequence which is always fun to play, but not in the speedrun. You skip that part. Assault on the control room can be done in about 10 minutes by tricking a Banshee to freak out early on and then drop its pilot in front of you, allowing you to then hijack the Banshee, since boarding it wasn't introduced until Halo 2. It needs to be an empty vehicle first, so if you can do that then great, you can just fly right to the end of the mission. Otherwise the normal way of playing involves a lot of stealth when done right, and that's pretty fun too, just not fast. 343 Guilty Spark gives you the shotgun and a couple of jumps to save a few seconds, so it's not too bad at all. Mostly memorable for introducing the Flood and that whole story transition. Not really a lot of skips to be done either, apart from one that was found fairly recently which involves a really annoying set of jumps which saves a lot of time, but I just never even knew about. I didn't do it. Didn't need to. The level's quite easy. Meanwhile, the library, right afterwards, surprisingly, hard level, but it only took me a couple of tries to get right. Like I said, it is a tough level, but knowing where everything is a massive help. So just a few well-placed grenades, a few grenade jumps to skip some doors that open very slowly, constantly moving, and knowing where to hide a couple of times, and boom, the nightmare is over. I thought it was easier to speedrun than it was to play just normally, in fact. Very odd. Two Betrayals was easily the opposite though. There's so much combat in this, and only a couple of parts where you can use vehicles to speed through or trick enemy despawns. So with the Flood and the Covenant being absolutely packed in all the tight corridors, you're in for a rough time optimizing every grenade, every rocket, and every single shot. Making those count is super important. Tons of ambushes, tons of packed rooms, not many checkpoints. This one took a good few hours to get right, and I still wasn't happy with my end result, but it was enough. Keys, though, the level, again, completely the opposite. By tricking a Flood right at the start to bump you through a wall, aptly named Flood Bumping, you can skip the entire level and be done in about 5 to 10 minutes. Super easy too. And the Maw, which plays way aggressively. You have to run between fighting factions and mostly hope that you make it, while finding explosives and putting them where they count, like most of the rest of the game to be honest. I got pretty decent at the main level, but the classic Warthog run at the end made me restart several times because I kept messing it up, and the checkpoints don't really trigger for like 5 minutes if you're unlucky like me, which means that every little mistake can cost you up to 5 minutes, which is just run ending at that point. And finally we come to LASO, which is legendary difficulty with all skulls on, that's what it stands for. That's Black Eye, shields recharge only on a melee hit. However, they do instantly recharge to full, unlike Reach, which takes time to do so, which means you can then slug it out with some singular enemies. But it's still extremely rough because actually getting into melee means that you'll take a lot of shots, so you're gonna die a ton. And elites aren't super stupid in this game, they will run away from you if you're just trying to close into melee. They'll just run and shoot you and you'll die. The Boom Skull, which doubles explosion radius, making plasmas on the ground a huge danger when chain explosions fling them around all over the place. Also, grunts and carrier form flood too, because of the grunt funeral skull, which makes grunts explode on death. It means these normally very weak enemies and very forgettable enemies can cause mass chain reactions in tight situations and absolutely ruin a good bit of progress. Though it does mean that you can use them to kill elites, and you'll need to, because of the Foreign Skull, which means that you can't use any Covenant weapons, making elites, with their personal shields, extremely hard to kill unless you can close in and melee them in the back. Very difficult stuff. Then there's the Famine Skull, making all weapons have half ammo, and the Recession Skull, making weapons use double ammunition per shot, which means that you're reloading more often and is a lot more punishing for non-headshots. Basically, you have a quarter of the total ammo that you normally would have, and you can't even use half of it because the weapons on the ground, all those Covenant weapons and all those sticky grenades, you just can't pick them up, you can't use them. Really tough. This was rough as hell to get around, to constantly be trying to save ammo against enemies with recharging shields that run away from you if you take them down. Man, you've got to try it yourself to really understand the magnitude of how difficult this was. The other skulls, of course, were Fog, which takes away your radar, Malfunction, which disables a random bit of your UI every time you respawn, which is nicer than Reach, taking all of it away, but still not super ideal, Mythic, which gives enemies more health, and finally Iron, which resets you to checkpoint if anybody dies in co-op, or resets the entire level if you die in single player. Oof. So how did it go? Well, I'll say this, without Kez, I would never have done LASO. So co-op with a patient friend is absolutely invaluable, but was tons of fun, very importantly. The netcode wasn't great at the time though, so do be aware that it's peer-to-peer, and for some reason Halo 1 gave the non-host, that was me, tons of input latency, which made things extremely difficult, but didn't persist into Halo 2, so I don't know if that's really a fair criticism or if it'll be fixed later down the road. Hell, it might have even been fixed now, it's been a long time since we played this. This is more than just a minor point too, it really is a big failing of the MCC on PC, and could indeed completely turn you off from it if you had a bad experience, so do be aware of that possibility going into it if you want to do co-op of LASO, otherwise the Legendary campaign isn't so bad at all, you can get around it. Anyway, starting out with the Pillar of Autumn, where ammo is frankly abundant, because there's human weapons everywhere, there's lots of pistols flying around, lots of grenades and grunts in tiny corridors to make use of as living bombs. Basically, this is quite an easy level, nice easy introduction with only a few difficultly placed elites to beat down, granting a false sense of security going forth. Into Halo, which was rough, honestly, a huge difference. There was not a lot of health packs here, the tough combat section right at the start with the dropships in open areas, forcing us to abuse long range to beat elites, or pistoling grunts near them to save ammo, and yeah, it was just really tough to do that. It took us a long time to get through that section having any ammo left at all. But luckily then you get the Warthog, which makes things a little bit simpler with the infinite ammo turret that you can abuse, but still not the smoothest experience. Saving the Marines, not easy. Lots of enemies to kill in Halo. Truth and Reconciliation was the hardest level by far if you don't conserve ammo and strategize. The sniper that you start out with, you need to keep through the entire level, and it runs out of ammo extremely fast. And you need it, you need that thing, because that and the AR are the only weapons you're going to find in the entire level. You literally don't have options inside the ship. None. This was unfairly tough, in fact. Lots of patience is required, and a lot of meleeing elites when you get the chance. Even when you don't get the chance, you just need to force that issue. Every single earned checkpoint was a huge relief. I wish I could say more about it, since it was so insanely harder than any other level we've ever played in any Halo game to date, but it's simply because there was no ammo to use. There's really not much more to say than that. It's very, very difficult. Extremely so. Next though was Silent Cartographer, which was a lot easier in fact. That Warthog skip that I mentioned earlier, and then mostly pretty easy combat. Those tight rooms make grunts almost allies again. Thankfully, a lot easier than expected, and we needed that after Truth and Reconciliation. And by this point we were starting to get used to how explosive and deadly the grunts were, so we were able to use those to our advantage a lot more too. Next comes Assault on the Control Room, which allows us to use the Banshee skip again, which Kez managed to nail absolutely first try. Good stuff. Real good stuff in fact, super easy, and that skips pretty much the entire level. Another 5 to 10 minute level, thankfully too. Then on to 343 Guilty Spark, which is pretty much get a shotgun, run and hope that you have enough ammo. 3 short levels in a row, not too bad, but meleeing Flood for shields absolutely sucks. The final sequence was a bit touch and go, but everything by this point was sliding into place on how to play with the LASO restrictions in place, and we were actually starting to weirdly get good at this, kind of, but this would be tested in the very next level. The Library, which I said wasn't too difficult before, but with LASO this was just under 4 hours of hell. The second hardest level, after Truth and Reconciliation I think, which pretty much just had to know the skips, have shields for every grenade jump possible that you can do, get lucky with a lot of stuff, especially with carrier form explosions, and the weapon flood spawns not instantly killing us, which happens a lot. You have to abuse melee when you're down to 1 or 2 flood for shields, while taking absolutely ages to kill them, 1 or 2 at a time, to conserve what tiny amount of ammo we had, because you need the shotgun, and they don't drop a lot of shotgun ammo when you're really desperately needing it, and the assault rifles and pistols that they do occasionally drop just aren't that useful, because they don't die. Turns out Flood have a lot of health with the Mythic Skull on. And finally, not getting screwed like we did at the final door by having one person skip it and the other not, because if you do that, it turns out you need both players at the end of the level to trigger that end sequence, which is bad. We got stuck at either end of that flood-filled room, and we just kind of had to make it past about 1,000 angry flood boys, which took us the best part of an hour, in fact, on that one checkpoint. You've also got to pray for checkpoints as well, and know when to clear enemies and when to just leg it. This level beat us both to a very depressing pulp, but god we were thankful to get done with it. Then on to 2 Betrayals, which was more of the same really. Combat is tough, but if you're careful with ammo and grenade placement on spawns and you've done the speedrun, then it's not too bad. The shield depletion rooms are upsetting though. If you have done Goatroped, then you'll be familiar with that stuff, and how to delete the many ambushes that come forth. Also, as a benefit to us doing it in co-op, we could actually abuse some quick teleports in and out of some corridors and some dangerous rooms, so that was quite handy to do. On to keys, and we just used the flood bump. Easy level, 5 to 10 minutes. Nothing really to say about this. We were really happy about it too. And finally, the Maw, which was mostly skippable when enemies are occupied, but tiny rooms again make explosions extremely dangerous, and since Sentinels and Flood like to explode a lot, yeah, it's bad. And I died to many delayed explosions constantly, because it turns out in Halo 1, when you're not looking at something exploding, it might not actually explode until you do look at it. So if something dies around the corner, it could be like directly around the corner and hasn't exploded yet, like a trip mine. So in other words, to activate that explosion, you're going to have to go around the corner and look at it as it's right in your face, and then you can't take cover, and boom! Suddenly you're redoing that whole section again. Big old thumbs up there for that, yeah. The core pipes towards the end as well can take 2 explosions to trigger because of the Mythic Skull, so don't let that catch you out. Make sure that you've got enough for frags and ammo and all sorts of stuff to deal with that, making the flood in that room a lot more dangerous too, and of course the Sentinels. And of course you won't be getting very many checkpoints either, because there's a lot of stuff attacking you constantly. And, on top of all that, make sure that you get out of that room with full health and shields too, for that Warthog run, because it took us like 30 minutes to get that right with my lag, because you are forced to get both players through that, because you can't leave one behind, because that person will randomly get teleported further along if they're not in the same Warthog as the first player, meaning that they're then put in danger, they'll probably die to explosions or enemies that are around, and then reset the whole thing for you both. Thanks, Iron Skull. Big old thumbs up for that one too. Yeah. I probably messed this up 12 to 30 times over and over again. Many of those were on the jump section by getting crushed by Kez or just getting a terrible landing, so that was pretty rough. I mean, fun, but pretty rough. So a lot of time was spent just on that Warthog section. But we beat it, and that's LASO. And Halo 1, again, I'm not going to talk about multiplayer too much because I'm just bad at it, but it was fun to mess about with. And it does of course add playtime to the game if you're into it, although Halo 1 multiplayer is quite janky these days. I mean, if you've played it, you'll probably know why. It's hard to articulate, but it is just weird. Thank you very much for watching and listening to me ramble on about Halo CE. I'll see you next time, hopefully, when we talk about Halo 2. This game, though, definitely worth it. I would give it a rocket flood out of 10.